So hi everyone, my name is Jacqueline and I'm from the Saskatchewan Science Centre. Today I bring you a very special guest and a good friend of the Science Centre here, Dr. Mark Brigham from the University of Regina's Biology Department. Dr. Brigham and I both work on the Science Centre's bat rescue program. Mark has been with us for over 10 years initiating this program and also is considered the bat expert. Now, luckily, Friday, April 17th is actually a Bat Appreciation Day, which is awesome. How are you doing today, Dr. Brigham?
I am well and fine today. I'm locked in my office, away from all people, and doing my best to continue to stay healthy.
Oh, excellent. Yes, of course. So today, can you tell us about the BAT program and how did it start?
So the association with the Science Centre and myself has gone back a long time. The Science Centre actually and my arrival in Regina were pretty much coincident. The Science Centre, I think, opened a year before I got here, and being a scientist, I've always been very keen to support it. And when my kids were young, went all the time for their sake. But I've also regularly sort of done public bat things for the Science Centre and most enjoyed that. I think the current program began about a decade or so ago when for reasons of, there's a national organization in Canada called the Canadian Council on Animal Care, and they decided it was not appropriate for us to house non-research bats at the university in a sort of a rescue fashion during the winter. And their suggestion was that we should humanely euthanize them. And I found that difficult, but also selfishly, when I give talks to school groups and service clubs and things like that, having an animal is a very, very valuable thing to show people what bats are really like. And so for me, it was important to continue to try to rescue them. And the Science Centre at that time simply stepped up and said we would be happy to look after these animals in the wintertime. It was a great relief to me because it meant all the feeding and care that myself and my students had been doing was taken off our hands. We could still use animals for public talks, and they would be well looked after. So it was the ideal partnership, and was and remain really, really keen to work with the Science Centre to continue to do this.
Oh, that's so awesome. Yeah, no, I'm definitely very admirable about that. I definitely respect that. So how do we normally get these bats? Where do they come from?
So the species that we almost always get is called the big brown bat, very common species in Saskatchewan. It's actually quite common over much of North America. Although there's big in the name, it actually is really not very big, although it's one of the bigger bats that we have in Canada. So it weighs normally in the summertime about 20 grams, and to put that in perspective, that's 3 loonies in your hands. They are one of the few species in North America that will try to hibernate in buildings. So almost all the bats that we come into happen usually between mid to late October and around about the 1st of April. And they are trying to hibernate in buildings. And my sense is that they pick bad places. Now, we have no idea how they choose the places that they try to hibernate in, but as best as we can tell, most of the animals are juveniles, so they were born the previous summer. And I like to say with some humor that, so they're teenagers, and like many teenagers, they make bad decisions. And what happens, it appears, is that they pick places where they run down their fat reserves more quickly than they can afford. And so the animals that come to our attention tend to be very, very thin. They've used up their fat reserves. They can't hibernate any longer, and they're in a desperate search for food and water, and they're on their last legs. So because they're doing things that make them come to people's attention, we tend, and the Science Centre does, and the Humane Society does, and various other places get calls for, I've got a bat in my living room, or I found a bat in my basement. And so what we've done is we go and pick them up. In the wintertime, you can't just let them go outside. It's too cold. And I say the bats are not usually in particularly good health. So we, in conjunction with the Science Centre folks, do our very best to feed them and get them back into shape so that we can let them go in the springtime. So it's effectively a rescue service where we provide a little bit of hospitalization and help for these animals over the winter with a goal of trying our best to release them in the spring. Certainly true that a number of them don't make it there, say in bad condition, and it's too late for us to do much, but many of them are successfully able to be kept for the rest of the winter.
Okay, yeah, for sure. So you mentioned that we have usually big brown bats, but what other kind of bats do we have in Saskatchewan?
Saskatchewan actually has records for 8 different species. The big brown bat, the little brown bat, which is also sort of found around Regina, also fairly regularly lives in buildings. It's about 1/3 the size of the big brown bat. The other 3 that are common in Saskatchewan, or at least in the southern part of Saskatchewan, are migratory species: the red bat, the hoary bat, and the silver hair bat. So unlike big browns and little browns, they don't hibernate for the winter, but they fly south. We don't know a lot about how far south, but they're only here in the summertime like migratory birds. And then the other common species you have to go to sort of the northern forests of Saskatchewan is called a long-eared bat. Looks very, very similar to a little brown, weighs 7 or 8 grams, so a little heavier than a loonie in your hand. So those are the 6 that are most common, and then a couple of records for a couple of others that have been from the Cypress Hills and from the very dry parts of Saskatchewan around Leader.
Sure, yeah. So you mentioned that the big brown bats are hibernating. What about our bats? Are they hibernating here as well, or are they doing something a little bit different?
So the ones that we keep at the Science Centre don't hibernate for the winter because they tend to be in really, really poor shape, and we have to get some. They don't have the body fat reserves necessary to be able to hibernate. So it has become easier to feed them for the winter. It also allows us and the folks at the Science Centre to show them off so that other people can come when they visit and see them. Now, we don't know if that causes any long-term harm to the bats. I really doubt it, but we need to get them in good shape to hopefully release them in the springtime so they don't hibernate in the Science Centre. However, bats have sort of another way, a cool trick, and that is they will allow their body temperature to fall to room temperature, even if they are being fed, which saves them a whole lot of energy. So when people come to the Science Centre and see the bats, they are in sort of what we call shallow torpor. And this is a way to save energy. It allows them to save the fat that they do put on as a result of our feeding them, so they don't keep their body temperatures warm all the time like we humans do. Hibernation is sort of a seasonal form of torpor where they allow their body temperature to drop substantially down to just above 0 and can live on a little bit of stored fat for a long period of time.
Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned that we have to fatten them up. What do we exactly feed them in order to gain all that weight?
So for most animals that eat insects, like even if you kept lizards or other things, the easiest thing to feed them are things called mealworms. Many people who ice fish would be familiar with mealworms because they are used as bait often. So mealworms are not a worm per se, they're actually the larval form of a beetle. So if you let them grow up, they will turn into beetles. So anyone who keeps mealworms knows that this happens. So mealworms are, I don't know, about the length of your thumb from the knuckle to the nail forward, and they tend to be tan, brown in color. They're not the absolute best most nutritious food because it would be like eating at a fast food restaurant all the time. They're pretty high in fat, and they are somewhat deficient in some minerals like calcium and iron. But the Science Center gives them special supplements of iron and calcium in the water that we let the bats drink, and that allows them to stay healthy. So it is one of the easiest things to feed insectivorous animals. And again, it's probably not the most fabulous diet, but over the course of the time that we have them, most seem to do okay. And then once they can start eating normal insects again, I'm sure they recover their condition quite quickly.
Mhm. It's also a lot easier than trying to give them moths or something that flies away or runs away really fast. These mealworms don't move very fast, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's an awful lot of work to feed bats over the winter time, and therefore there is a trade-off in convenience versus being able to feed them natural things. And trying to buy moths is not possible, so that's really not an option. And for precisely the same reason that people use convenience to go to a fast food restaurant to get a meal, we're or you're doing the same thing. I'm sorry, I keep saying we're as if I'm doing it. It's not me that's doing it. It's the folks at the Science Center that are doing all the work. But
Mm-hmm.
anyone who keeps bats in captivity, pardon me, that are insect eating would use mealworms. They're a very common thing to feed insect eating animals in captivity.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Yeah. So when we encounter bats, should we be worried about bats hurting me, or do they bite or anything like that? Is that something I should be worried about?
There's lots of myths surrounding bats, and most of them are untrue. And certainly, if you're out in the summertime and see bats flying around, they have no interest in you whatsoever. And there is absolutely no risk, in my view. The only time a bat is going to try to bite is if you try to catch it. And imagine you trying to catch something that is really, really small. The only way it can defend itself is by biting, and therefore it's simply biting to try to get you to let it go so it can sort of fly away. Now, they do have very sharp teeth, very strong jaws. And the reason for that is that insects that they eat, all bats in Saskatchewan eat nothing but insects. Insects are very hard. And so to crack the shell and to eat insects, you have to have really sharp teeth with strong jaws. So if they do bite, especially the big brown or the hoary or the silver haired, you are going to feel it. It's going to hurt. Now, what they tend to do is bite and hold on. And you sort of blow on them to get them to release themselves. But all that said, as long as you don't try to catch and handle one, you are never going to get bitten. If you, especially in the wintertime, happen to find one in a building and need to put it in a box or something for us to come and pick it up, absolutely wear a pair of gloves that are substantial, so that are leather. Leather, like golf gloves or curling gloves, are quite reasonable. Bats are not strong enough to bite through those, but you don't want to handle them with your bare hands.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that is not only do the bites hurt, but once in a while, and I really want to emphasize once in a while, very rarely, bats can have the virus that causes rabies. So if they bite you and happen to have the virus that causes rabies, they will transmit that virus to humans. And the rabies virus, in contrast to the coronavirus for the vast majority of people, is going to kill you. So it's a very dangerous virus, and we do not want anything to do with it. So the only way that can be transmitted is by getting a bite from a mammal. Now, other mammals are more commonly found with rabies than bats, but it does happen once in a while, and therefore yet another reason not to put yourself in a situation to get bitten.
So if there is, let's say if there is an encounter where I do get bit, is there something, what should I do if I do get bit?
If you are bitten by a bat, there are sort of a couple of things that you should do. If you are able to retain the bat, that's a good thing because it can be tested for whether or not it has rabies. Now, for me personally, that's always a bit of a hardship because the only way to test it is to kill it. And that's a shame, but rabies is a very dangerous disease, so be it. But even if you can't, retain the bat, you do need to avail yourself of your physician, and you will get sent to the Saskatchewan Public Health Authority, and they will begin you a series of injections. It's currently 4 that you get, and it's in the arm, hasn't been in the stomach for 50 years. They're small little needles about the size of a flu shot, and they will totally, utterly protect you against the virus that causes rabies. So we've had a vaccine against the rabies virus for a long, long time. So anyone who's a veterinarian, anyone who regularly deals with mammals has had these shots to protect them against rabies.
Yeah.
So that's what you need to do, because rabies is a very dangerous disease and no laughing matter. So you need to protect yourself. But to me, the biggest way is to not put yourself in a situation where you can be bitten. Then you never have an issue.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I know we talked a little bit about those concerns, but what's the benefit of having bats? Why do we even want to have bats around?
Well, as a biologist, I'm interested in the natural world, and I think we want to have all organisms that are around us be successful. It makes our where we live a nicer place to be. So I think all things should be conserved and promoted. But bats in particular eat huge numbers of flying insects every single night in the summertime. Many of those insects are things that we don't particularly like. They buzz in our ears, they get around us, they make noise, all those kinds of things. They eat our crops, they defoliate trees. So bats are doing a really good job but helping to control those insects without us using chemicals and pesticides and those sorts of things. So they're doing us a great favor simply by going around eating. So a 20-gram big brown bat can eat between 5 and 10 grams of insects every single night in the summertime. Now, unfortunately, many people ask me, so do they eat mosquitoes? Which, living in Regina, would be a wonderful thing in many summers. They probably occasionally eat mosquitoes, but we have to remember that mosquitoes are really quite small, and thus they're not really worthwhile for most bats because they're too small. But also, mosquitoes don't fly that much. They only fly when there's a target around that is something for the mosquito to bite. So all the bats we have in Saskatchewan only eat insects that are flying. They can't detect them very well on the ground, so they don't worry about them on the ground. So it's only flying insects. And unfortunately, they don't eat a lot of mosquitoes, but they eat lots of other things that we don't particularly like.
So how do those bats detect all those insects flying around?
Bats have all the bats we have in Saskatchewan have a really cool system. It's called echolocation. What it basically means is both to orient, find their way around, and to find food, bats fly around screaming. So they make very, very loud sounds and listen for the echoes that those sounds make off trees, off branches, off buildings, off the ground, off the surface of the water, and off insects. And therefore, they can find their way around, but they can also detect prey. Now, fortunately for us, we can't hear these sounds because they're too high pitched. Your dog or your cat can hear them, but humans actually have pretty lousy hearing, and we can't detect the sounds that they're making, but they are very loud, and it allows bats to do some amazing things.
Yeah, for sure. So as a biologist, what do you think the biggest risks to the bats in Saskatchewan is?
I guess there are 3 big risks. One is simple persecution by people, because most people don't really like them, and if they find one, their first thought is to tend to kill it, unfortunately, which is one reason that I try to do things, and lots of other people do, to try to sort of illustrate the benefits of them. The second risk is to the species in Saskatchewan that hibernate. The little brown bat and the long-eared bat in northern Saskatchewan in particular are being really strongly hurt by something called white nose syndrome. This is a fungal disease that was introduced by accident from Europe to North America. And it seems to interfere with hibernation in those two species. And both of those species have been declared endangered in Canada because of that disease. Now, fortunately, although it's all around us, there's no record of it yet in Saskatchewan, but it has decimated the bats in Ontario East. It certainly occurs in British Columbia, and there are recent records of it from Manitoba. So it's not far away, and we're expecting that those two species are going to decline quite dramatically in Saskatchewan when this fungus arrives here, and there doesn't seem to be anything that stops it. For the species that migrate, I would say the biggest danger to them is something that we can fix, and that is wind turbines kill huge numbers of bats during fall migration. Not during the spring migration, very, very few, but during fall migration. And it appears that bats are attracted to many of the turbines that we put up in order to generate electricity. Now, don't get me wrong, I think those turbines are great. It's a really good way to generate electricity. It's renewable and all those good things. But as biologists, we have to find ways to make those turbines kill many fewer bats. And we're actively working on those things. We have to put them in places where bats aren't as common, and we probably are going to have to turn them off for a little while at dusk for a couple of hours in August and September to minimize how many bats are killed. We can fix the problem. We will fix the problem. But right now, for example, it's thought that hundreds of thousands of hoary bats are killed every year at wind turbines across North America, and we need to slow that down.
No, for sure. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So with this recent pandemic, COVID-19, it's theorized that the virus actually came from bats. Is there a risk of the virus spreading to the bats in Saskatchewan?
So we still have lots to learn about this particular virus and specifically where it came from and how it jumped and all that sort of stuff. But what I'm aware of now is that it is likely from what's called a horseshoe bat that lives in Asia, in the Wuhan area of China. And it appears, and this is not for sure, it's still speculation, we still have to work it out, that it likely jumped to another animal, and then from that animal to humans. So I need to be very careful how I talk about this because we simply don't have all the data yet, and we may never know for sure, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
We do know that bats naturally harbor a large number of corona-like viruses, and they don't appear to get sick from them. So they have evolved with these viruses over long periods of time, and it's just something they carry around. We carry around lots of viruses in us that don't make us sick. So bats have evolved to be with these things. So the problem is that occasionally, if the bats are brought in close contact with other animals or humans, there is the possibility that the virus can move between different hosts. And this would be the argument for why the live animal markets in many places in Asia are not a good idea, because it increases that risk of movement between one animal and another. Now, even though those markets have been around for a long time and there's lots and lots of them, that shows how unlikely and rare this jumping from one host to another is. But it's probably how it happens. So, as biologists in North America, we're pretty sure, although again, we've got lots to learn and there's going to be lots of science done when we can get back into our labs, we're pretty sure that the COVID-19 virus does not occur in North American bats. However, North American bats may well be able to take it on board if biologists start handling bats and happen to have the COVID-19 virus. So if I'm sick, I could potentially give the virus to a bat. So it's important and to be very cautious. The recommendation is that we shouldn't be handling bats for the next little while until we know the likelihood of that jumping taking place. And the risk might be if it can move to a bat, then maybe the bat can spread it to other bats. and that we could have a whole lot of bats that have not evolved with that virus get sick and die here, and we don't want that to happen. So
Mm.
there's lots to learn about bats and viruses, and to me, from a positive point of view, the most important thing is that we could learn how bats manage to have a variety of coronaviruses and not get sick. We can learn things from that to help protect humans. There's also considerable data to suggest that although bats have coronaviruses, and it's likely that ultimately the one that's afflicted us has come from a bat, that bats aren't the source of lots and lots of things that are going to cause disease in humans. Lots of animals have things that potentially can jump, and we have to do a better job of separating humans and animals, letting them live in peace to absolutely minimize the risk that those things can happen. So I would argue that most of the problems have been caused, as usual, by people rather than it's bats or other wildlife doing things to us. So I want to be very clear and suggest that this should not cause anyone to think badly of bats and think we should go out and control bats. That's not a way to solve this problem. We need to learn from them and treat them like all animals with respect.
For sure. So what are scientists doing to prevent that exposure to the bats?
Well, the recommendation in Canada and the United States, I can't speak for anywhere else yet, from sort of wildlife agencies, is that until we know more, we should be very careful and minimize any handling and research done on bats to minimize the risk of spreading the virus to them. The argument would be that the likelihood that we can do that is exceptionally low. The likelihood that the bats will get sick from the virus is exceptionally low. But if those things happened, the outcome could potentially be really, really bad. And therefore, we should take precautions. And like, in my opinion, the way governments are trying to help people deal with this virus, is what we want is in a few months' time for people to point a finger at us and say, you overreacted. You did way more than you needed to do. That would make me very happy, because that means no or many, many fewer bad things happened as a result. So I want to be accused of overreacting in a few months as opposed to being accused of underreacting.
Yeah, for sure. So because there probably isn't going to be a ton of research this summer studying bats or anything like that, just because of this pandemic, how can people help scientists and bats with still social distancing? Here, sorry, let me do this again. Okay. How can people help scientists and bats still with social distancing?
Well, I guess one bit of research we hope to do this summer still is we can use what are called bat detectors to actually eavesdrop on the echolocation calls that they make without ever touching them. So we are still looking to try to determine where bats are and how active they are this summer using these devices. And we can set those up in a variety of places. Now, can't do this until the state of emergency is lifted and it's really safe for people to do it. But I still hope to have some students doing some work with those devices this coming summer. How people can help is plain and simply by enjoying the fact that bats will be around. So when it gets to be nice outside, if spring ever happens in Saskatchewan this year, sitting out on your back deck of a night in the summertime and watching bats fly over and just appreciating their cool flight maneuvers and how they can turn tightly and twist and turn and watching them fly and just appreciating them is, I think, the best thing people can do for them, and simply enjoy them in that way.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for talking with us today. It was great to learn about those bats from the Batman himself. Is there a place that maybe people can go for more information, or if they have questions about bats in Saskatchewan?
In terms of specific questions about bats in Saskatchewan, I'm always happy to field them. And you can find me on the University of Regina website in the biology department. I'm happy to get an email or something like that. Don't mind at all. More generally, the organization I point people towards is something called Bat Conservation International. It's an American organization, but it does things for bats all over the world. And if you Google Bat Conservation International or even just BCI, it will come up, and there's lots of very cool educational information that they spread. I'd like to say it's not fake news, although they certainly have a vested interest in portraying bats positively, as opposed to many of the negative stereotypes that they carry in most people's minds. But those would be either through me or through them would be two places that they can get lots of information.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mark.
My great pleasure. Most enjoyed chatting with you, and here's to spring arriving.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much. All right.
Bye-bye.